Hello, family. Before we dive into this story, I want to take a moment to send some love and gratitude to all of my amazing listeners from Malawi, Lebanon, Kenya, Jamaica, Sierra Leone, Trinidad, and Tobago. Your support means the world to me, and knowing that my stories are reaching you across the globe fills me with so much joy. Kofi Mensah had it all, an empire of wealth and power, but behind the glittering facade was a man haunted by betrayal. After 3 failed marriages, Kofi risks everything with one final, cruel test to uncover if love can truly be real, or if it's just another illusion. Kofi Mensah stood on the balcony of his hilltop mansion, the glowing lights of Accra sprawling beneath him. From here, the city glittered like diamonds, each flicker a testament to his empire. His hotels, his luxury real estate, his global investments, they were the veins pumping wealth and influence into his life. A man born to humble beginnings, Kofi had clawed his way up through the layers of society until the world bowed before him. And yet, standing alone in the silence of his mansion, Kofi felt the weight of loneliness pressing on his chest. At 55, Kofi had built an empire that made him one of Africa's wealthiest men. Yet all the success, all the power, could not fill the void that had grown deeper with each passing year. It was an emptiness money couldn't touch, the need for love, real, unvarnished love. He'd been married 3 times. Each wife at first had seemed perfect, poised, beautiful, enchanting. Each woman dazzled him with affection, promising forever. But in the end, forever was fleeting. Their love turned out to be transactional, their affections dwindling once they secured their piece of his wealth. The bitterness of those betrayals weighed heavily on Kofi's soul. Tonight, Kofi wasn't alone in his thoughts. His lifelong friend, Kwame Ayite, sat nearby, the 2 of them sipping whiskey under the starlit sky. Kwame had been by Kofi's side from childhood. Through every triumph and heartbreak, he had watched as Kofi's empire expanded and his heart closed, brick by brick. "You're brooding again," Kwame observed, setting down his glass. He had seen this look in Kofi's eyes before, and he knew exactly what haunted his friend. Kofi let out a slow breath. "It's hard not to, Kwame. I've built everything, this house, the empire, the power, but none of it matters if I can't find someone who loves me for who I am." Kwame studied him for a moment, his eyes softening. "You keep choosing women from this world you've built. They're part of the same circle, used to money, used to status. That's all they know. You can't expect them to see beyond that when it's what defines their lives too." Kofi sighed deeply. "But what choice do I have? My life is built on this. How do I find someone who doesn't see me as just a ticket to wealth?" "Maybe it's time to stop looking in the same places," Kwame said quietly. "You've been surrounding yourself with women who come from wealth. Maybe it's time to look outside your circle, to find someone who isn't wrapped up in all of this." Kofi frowned, swirling the whiskey in his glass. The idea seemed almost absurd. A billionaire marrying someone outside his world? Someone who didn't know or care about his fortune? But the more he thought about it, the more Kwame's words resonated. "I don't even know where to begin," Kofi admitted, leaning back in his chair. "How do I find someone who isn't blinded by my wealth?" "Start by stepping out of your world," Kwame said with a smile. "Take a chance. What's the worst that could happen? You've already tried it the other way 3 times. Kofi laughed, though the sound was tinged with bitterness. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been the one doing it wrong." 2 months later, Kofi met her, Afia Danso. The introduction was nothing like Kofi's previous encounters with women. It wasn't at a high-profile charity event or an exclusive gala. Instead, it was at a quiet family gathering. far from the glitz and glamour of Accra's elite social scene. Afia wasn't part of that world. She was a school teacher from a small village in the Ashanti region. She had come to the city to visit her sister, who happened to know someone in Kofi's circle. When Afia first met Kofi, she didn't even recognize him. And even when she learned of his identity, she remained unfazed. No awe, no probing questions about his wealth or his empire. Just a quiet smile and a genuine curiosity about him as a person. For Kofi, this was refreshing. For years, he had been surrounded by people who only cared about his wealth. But Afia was different. She didn't ask him about his business or his properties. Instead, they talked about simple things, family, dreams, and the world outside the walls of his mansion. Afia's beauty wasn't the polished high society type Kofi was used to. She wore simple, modest clothing, and her hair was always tied back in a neat bun. Her eyes sparkled with warmth and kindness, not with ambition or greed. There was something calming about her presence, something grounding. As their conversations deepened, Kofi learned more about her life. Afia spoke passionately about her work as a school teacher, her dreams of building a school in her village to give children better opportunities. She talked about her family with love, sharing stories of growing up in a tight-knit community. To Kofi, it was like a breath of fresh air, far removed from the superficial world he had known for so long. Their courtship was quiet, almost private. They went on long walks through quieter parts of Accra, visited small cafes where no one recognized him, and talked for hours. Kofi felt a peace he hadn't known in years. For once, he was with someone who seemed to care for him, not for his empire or his wealth, but for the man he was beneath it all. After months of this quiet, steady companionship, Kofi found himself falling in love with Afia. It wasn't the wild, passionate love he had known before. It was something deeper, more solid, something real. And so, one evening, as they sat together in the fading light, Kofi proposed. His heart pounded as he waited for her response, but Afia smiled, her eyes soft and full of warmth. "Yes, Kofi," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their wedding was nothing like his previous marriage. No extravagant displays of wealth, no media attention, no grand ballroom filled with the rich and famous. Just a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends. For the first time in his life, Kofi felt like he was living in a moment that was real, untouched by the glittering illusions of wealth and power. But as the months passed, the scars from Kofi's past began to creep back into his mind. Kofi couldn't shake the feelings of doubt that had plagued him for years. His previous marriages had left him with deep emotional wounds, betrayals that had scarred him in ways he wasn't sure he could heal. Though Afia seemed different, there was a voice in the back of his mind, a whisper that told him to be careful. What if she was like the others? What if beneath her gentle nature she was just waiting for the right moment to reveal her true intentions? Kofi had been fooled before, and each time the betrayal had been devastating. Could he risk it again? He tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered, dark and heavy. Every time Afia smiled at him, every time she held his hand or laughed at one of his jokes, Kofi found himself wondering, is this real, or is she just playing the long game? Then came Kojo. One morning, as they sat together over breakfast, Afia casually mentioned her childhood friend. Kojo had recently moved to Accra from their village and was looking for work. "He's a skilled carpenter," Afia said, her tone light. "He just needs someone to give him an opportunity." Kofi felt a pang of discomfort. "Kojo?" he asked, his voice tight. Afia smiled. "Yes, we grew up together. He's like a brother to me." A brother. The words didn't sit well with Kofi. He had heard stories like this before. Old friends, close bonds from childhood. He knew how those relationships could shift, and the more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. "Why haven't you mentioned him before?" Kofi asked, trying to keep his tone even. Afia shrugged lightly. "He only just moved here, and we haven't been in touch for years. I didn't think it was important." But to Kofi, it was important. The idea of Kojo, this old friend from her past, lurking in the background, began to gnaw at him. Was Kojo really just a friend? Or was there something more? As the days passed, Kofi's suspicions grew. His paranoia, once a faint whisper, became a steady drumbeat in his mind. He started watching Afia more closely, reading into every glance, every smile she shared with Kojo when he came to visit. And with each visit, Kofi's fear deepened. Kojo seemed full of life, young, energetic, charming. The complete opposite of Kofi in his current state of constant worry. What if Afia was drawn to that energy? What if she was secretly tired of being with him? These thoughts consumed Kofi, leaving him restless and anxious. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He needed to know the truth. He needed to be sure that Afia wasn't like the others. And so he devised a plan, a test, drastic and cruel, but one he convinced himself was necessary. One afternoon, on a routine drive back from one of his properties, Kofi's driver swerved the car off the road into a shallow ditch, just as Kofi had instructed. The damage was minor, but it set the stage for what would follow. Kofi was rushed to the hospital, where doctors, under his orders, told Afia that he had suffered severe spinal damage and was paralyzed from the waist down. When Afia arrived at the hospital, her face pale with shock, Kofi lay in the bed, pretending to be weak and helpless. "Kofi," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened?" "It was an accident," Kofi said quietly, his voice strained. "The doctors say I'll never walk again." Afia collapsed into tears, her hand clutching his. "No, Kofi, no." As he watched her cry, guilt gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He needed to know. He needed to see if her love would endure, even now that he could no longer be the strong, powerful man she had married. The test had begun. In the months that followed, Afia was the perfect wife. She cared for Kofi with patience and love, attending to his every need. She helped him dress, made his meals, and sat with him for hours, talking or simply holding his hand. She never complained, never expressed frustration. And yet, as time wore on, Kofi began to notice subtle changes. Afia's laughter grew quieter. Her smiles became less frequent. At night, she sat by the window, staring out into the darkness for hours. Was she tired of playing the role of the dutiful wife? Was she waiting for her opportunity to leave? Kofi's mind raced with suspicion. Every conversation between Afia and Kojo fed into his growing paranoia. He began to watch them more closely, convinced that something was happening between them. One afternoon, as Kofi lay in bed, he overheard a conversation between Afia and Kojo. They spoke in hushed tones, but he caught enough to set his heart racing. "You know I can't do this forever, Kojo," Afia said, her voice low. Kofi's stomach churned. "Do what forever? Take care of me? Pretend to love me?" He couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. Kofi hired private investigators to follow Afia, to document her every move. The reports came back inconclusive. Afia wasn't meeting Kojo in secret, and there was no evidence of an affair, but the doubt lingered. Kofi couldn't let go of the idea that Afia was just waiting for the right moment. The tension in the house became unbearable. Kofi could no longer contain his suspicions, and one stormy night, he finally erupted. Afia, he called, his voice sharp with anger. We need to talk. Afia entered the room, her face filled with concern. What is it, Kofi? Are you seeing Kojo? Kofi asked, his voice trembling with rage. Are you having an affair behind my back? Afia's eyes widened in shock. What? Kofi, what are you talking about? I know what's going on, Kofi shouted, unable to hold back. I've had you followed. I've heard the conversations. I know you've been spending time with him. Don't lie to me. Tears welled up in Afia's eyes. Kofi, how could you? Because I know what people are like. Kofi's voice cracked with the weight of his paranoia. I know what everyone wants from me. For a long moment, Afia said nothing. She simply stared at him, her expression one of deep sadness. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. Kofi, you think I don't know about your test? Kofi froze, his heart pounding in his chest. What? I know you're not paralyzed, Kofi, Afia said, her voice trembling with emotion. I found out weeks ago. I overheard Kwame talking to the doctors. Kofi's world spun. She knew? All this time, she had known? I stayed because I love you, Afia continued, tears streaming down her face. I stayed because I wanted to show you that love isn't about money or power. It's about trust. And I thought if I stayed, you'd see that. But all you've done is doubt me. But your insecurities, they've consumed you. You can't even see that I've been trying to help you heal. She wiped her tears away, her hands trembling. All those conversations with Kojo, they weren't what you think. We've been working on something for you. Kojo's been helping me design a community center in your name. I wanted to surprise you, to show you that love isn't about tests or games. It's about trust. Kofi's throat tightened, guilt washing over him in waves. Afia, I can't do this anymore, Afia said, her voice breaking. I love you, but I can't live like this, constantly being tested, constantly being doubted. You need to heal, Kofi, but I can't do it for you. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Kofi alone with his guilt and regret. The months that followed were the darkest of Kofi's life. Afia was gone, and with her, the one chance he had at finding real love. The mansion, once filled with life, now felt cold and empty. Kofi could no longer ignore the truth. He had destroyed the very thing he had been searching for. Desperate to heal, Kofi sought therapy. The sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront the scars of his past, the betrayals that had shaped his mistrust. He talked about his failed marriages, about the women who had used him for his wealth. But he also talked about Afia and how his own insecurities had driven her away. It wasn't an easy process. There were days when Kofi wanted to quit, days when he felt like the pain was too deep to overcome. But slowly, piece by piece, he began to heal. He poured his energy into the community center that Afia and Kojo had been working on. It became his sanctuary, a place where he could give back, where he could atone for the mistakes he had made. He dedicated his resources to making the center a success, helping underprivileged children from Afia's village receive the education they deserved. Months later, the community center was finally ready to open. It was a modest affair, no media, no grand displays of wealth, just the quiet excitement of children running through the halls, their laughter filling the space with life. Kofi stood at the entrance, watching as the children explored their new school. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from success or power. It was a peace that came from knowing he was doing something good, something meaningful. And then across the room, he saw her. Afia stood near the entrance, surrounded by children, her face glowing with happiness. She looked different, freer, more radiant. Kofi's heart raced as he walked toward her, his steps slow and uncertain. "Afia," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She turned to him, her eyes soft but guarded. "Kofi." He swallowed hard, the weight of his mistakes heavy on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "For everything. I let my fears destroy us. I let my past control me." Afia looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then finally, she spoke. "I forgive you, Kofi, but trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight." "I know," Kofi said, his voice low, "but I'm willing to work for it. I'm willing to try if you'll let me." Afia smiled softly, though there was still a sadness in her eyes. "We'll see, Kofi. We'll see." And so they began again, not with grand promises or elaborate gestures, but with the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding trust. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but this time, Kofi understood that real love couldn't be tested. It had to be earned day by day in the small moments that built a life together. And for the first time in his life, Kofi was willing to do the work. The end. Thank you for joining us on Kofi Mensah's emotional journey from wealth to redemption. If you enjoyed this story of love, trust, and transformation, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales. Stay tuned for stories that challenge the heart and mind.